September 21st, 1327. Berkeley Castle stood quietly in the Gloucestershire countryside, cloaked in autumn mist and medieval secrecy. Its thick, unyielding stone walls, built to fortify against enemies, were now the silent witnesses to a grotesque act of violence. Inside, deep in its fortified belly, a man lay dying. Once the most powerful figure in England, he was now unrecognizable, his dignity stripped, his body weakened by months of imprisonment and abuse. He was 43 years old, though he looked much older. His beard had gone gray. His eyes, once filled with pride and stubborn ambition, were dull with despair. The iron shackles that had bound his wrists and ankles left raw, red sores, cutting deep into the flesh of a man who was born to rule, but was now reduced to nothing. His name was Edward of Carnarvon, Edward II of England, and this night would mark the final chapter in one of the most bizarre and brutal episodes in royal history. The door to his chamber creaked open in the dead of night. Two men entered, not with food or water, but with purpose and with instruments of torture. In their hands, they carried a red-hot iron, its tip glowing with malevolent heat. What followed was not merely an execution. It was a message, a punishment symbolic in its savagery, carefully designed to be both a physical obliteration and a final humiliation. Edward was restrained. A hollow horn was inserted into his rectum, and through it, the red-hot iron was forced into his body, burning his internal organs while leaving his outer flesh untouched. His screams, filled with agony and horror, were muffled beneath pillows, silenced by those who had come to erase him from history without leaving a mark. By morning, the former king was dead. His body was found contorted, his face twisted in what could only be described as a final, frozen expression of unbearable pain. Yet the official report, read by courtiers and echoed in whispered conversations throughout the realm, stated that he had died of natural causes. This version of Edward's death, long passed down, has taken on a life of its own. It is dramatic, horrifying, and symbolically rich. It speaks of punishment, not just for political failure, but for personal sin, for a life that defied the norms of kingship and morality. It is the most infamous story of his end. But is it the truth? To unravel the mystery behind this gruesome legend, we must first understand the life of the man himself. We must travel back in time, back to the reign of Edward I, the iron-willed warrior king known as the Hammer of the Scots. On April 25, 1284, in the fortress of Carnarvon in Wales, Edward's fourth surviving son was born. He would later become heir to the throne after the deaths of his older brothers. But even as a child, Edward of Carnarvon displayed traits that set him apart from his lineage. Where his father was cold, calculating, and obsessed with conquest, young Edward was gentle, emotional, and drawn to activities considered unbecoming of royalty. He preferred swimming in rivers to horseback drills. He found joy in music, crafts, and the company of peasants. He reportedly dug ditches, fixed roofs, and even practiced blacksmithing, all things that horrified the royal court. Edward I, deeply traditional and fiercely authoritarian, was repulsed by his son's behavior. Chronicles from the time describe the old king's outbursts, including a shocking incident where he tore out chunks of his son's hair in a fit of rage, furious that Edward had dared to ask for a noble title for one of his friends. But that friend was no ordinary companion. He was Piers Gvestin, a young noble of Gascon origin, who had not only captivated Edward's heart, but would become the storm around which the future king's ruin would revolve. Gavestin had entered Edward's life as a court companion, but their relationship quickly deepened. By the time Edward ascended to the throne in 1307 at the age of 23, one of his first official acts as king was to recall Gavestin from exile, banished previously by Edward I, and elevate him to the title of Earl of Cornwall. This title, historically reserved for members of the royal bloodline, was now in the hands of a foreign-born courtier, and the nobility erupted in fury. The situation worsened when Edward granted Gavestin royal lands, treasures, and even allowed him to carry the sacred crown of Saint Edward during the coronation, a privilege never before afforded to a non-royal. The nature of Edward's attachment to Gavestin was hotly debated. Chroniclers of the time used poetic yet ambiguous language. They wrote that the king loved him beyond measure, and that they had formed a bond of indissoluble affection. Some historians argue this was typical of medieval chivalric friendship, where knights often pledged loyalty and emotional devotion to one another. Others point to later accusations of sodomy and suggest that the relationship may have been romantic or even sexual in nature. In 1334, a bishop would explicitly accuse the deceased Edward of such acts, an accusation that carried grave moral weight in medieval England. But regardless of whether their bond was romantic or platonic, it had political consequences. Gavestin's arrogance and unchecked influence made him enemies among the most powerful lords of England. He openly mocked them, even inventing mocking nicknames for them at court. His unchecked power infuriated the nobility and destabilized Edward's fragile claim to leadership. Then came the final insult, Edward's marriage. In 1308, Edward married Isabella of France, daughter of the powerful King Philip IV, in what was meant to be a diplomatic alliance. Isabella was only 12 years old at the time, a child bride in a political game. But rather than using the marriage to solidify his rule and unite the kingdom, Edward focused his attention entirely on Gavestin. During the wedding celebrations, he allegedly ignored his young queen, doting on Gavestin instead. The jewels intended as wedding gifts for Isabella were said to have been given to Gavestin. To the French court and the English nobility alike, this was more than a scandal. It was an outrage. It was an insult to a future queen, and it was a dangerous mistake. Isabella, though young, would not forget the humiliation, nor would the English barons forget the insult to their class and customs. Slowly, resentment grew within the court, within the nobility, and even within the royal family itself. Edward's enemies began to organize, and Gavestin's days were numbered. This was the beginning of a king's slow, tragic downfall. A reign marked not by war or glory, but by betrayal, favoritism, and disastrous judgment. The seeds had been planted. The storm was coming, and by the time it reached Edward, it would sweep away everything: his allies, his throne, and finally, his life. The final years of King Edward II's reign were marked by chaos, betrayal, and brutality. From the outset, his rule was plagued by political miscalculations, and none was more damning than his obsessive favoritism towards certain courtiers. Chief among them was Piers Gvestin, a man whose rapid rise to power drew the ire of England's nobility. The resentment grew so intense that Edward's own cousin, Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, led a coalition of nobles to demand Gavestin's exile. Reluctantly, Edward agreed, but it would not be the last time. Time and again, the king recalled Gavestin to court, each return deepening the hostility of the barons. This dangerous cycle continued until 1312, when the nobles finally took matters into their own hands. Gavestin was captured, summarily executed, stabbed, and beheaded at the side of a road. His death marked a turning point in Edward's reign. The king was inconsolable, vowing vengeance upon the assassins, but the power dynamics of the realm forced him into an uneasy truce with the very men responsible for his favorite's death. Yet the problems Edward faced extended far beyond personal grievances. Militarily, he suffered one of the most catastrophic defeats in English history. In 1314, at the Battle of Banickburn, Edward's forces were routed by the Scots under Robert the Bruce. The loss not only shattered English morale, but also reversed many of the territorial gains made by Edward's formidable father, Edward I. This defeat irreparably damaged the king's authority and emboldened his enemies. Meanwhile, on the administrative front, Edward proved inept. Under his rule, the royal treasury was drained and mismanagement ran rampant. The realm's finances collapsed, and with them, the trust of his subjects. After Gavestin's death, one might have expected Edward to tread more carefully. Instead, he repeated his earlier mistake. this time with even greater consequences. He elevated a new favorite, Hugh Despenser the Younger, and soon Despenser and his father became the most powerful men in the kingdom. With Edward's backing, they effectively seized control of the government, using their influence to enrich themselves and destroy their rivals. The Despensers amassed land and titles, and their reign was characterized by ruthless suppression. Enemies were executed, lands were confiscated, and dissent was brutally crushed. Among those most affected by their rise was Queen Isabella. No longer a passive figure in the background, Isabella found herself marginalized and politically neutered. She watched as her husband's affections and loyalties were consumed by the Despensers, and a deep hatred began to take root. Hatred not only for them, but for Edward himself. By 1325, Isabella's resentment had reached its breaking point. She was sent to France on a diplomatic mission, but once there, she made a bold and unprecedented decision. She would not return to England unless the Despensers were removed from power. In exile, she encountered Roger Mortimer, a powerful baron and former enemy of Edward who had dramatically escaped from the Tower of London. The two became allies and lovers. Together, they forged a plan to invade England, depose the king, and eliminate the Despensers once and for all. In September of 1326, they launched their invasion with a relatively small army. But what they lacked in numbers, they made up for in support. To Edward's dismay, nearly all the nobility and the common people rallied to Isabella and Mortimer's cause. The king and his favorites fled westward in a desperate attempt to hold on to power, but it was futile. They were captured within weeks. What followed was a scene of medieval retribution at its most brutal. Hugh Despenser the Younger, in particular, faced an execution so horrific that it was remembered for generations. Dragged through the streets by horses, he was hanged from a towering gallows, 15 meters high, only to be cut down before death could claim him. What came next was pure savagery. He was castrated, his genitals burned before his eyes, and then disemboweled while still conscious. His intestines were pulled from his body and set ablaze. Only after enduring this torture was he finally beheaded. His severed head was then placed on display atop London Bridge, a warning to all who might follow in his footsteps. As for Edward, his fate was sealed. In January 1327, he was forced to abdicate the throne in favor of his 14-year-old son, now crowned Edward III. At first, the deposed king was held in reasonably comfortable conditions. But that would soon change. In April of the same year, he was transferred to Berkeley Castle, where he was placed under the watchful eyes of Thomas Berkeley, John Maltravers, and Thomas Gurney. From this point onward, Edward's confinement became increasingly cruel. Reports suggest he was deliberately kept in unsanitary quarters, denied basic comforts, and subjected to humiliations, such as being made to ride without pants to irritate his skin. Some accounts even hint at psychological torture, all aimed at breaking his spirit and hastening his death through natural causes. The reasoning behind this slow torment was likely political. Isabella and Mortimer sought to eliminate Edward without bearing the public guilt of outright murder. But Edward proved more resilient than expected. Months passed, and the former king stubbornly clung to life. As rumors began to swirl of plots to rescue him, the situation grew more urgent for his captors. Finally, on the night of September 21st, 1327, Edward II was allegedly murdered. And it is here that the story takes a turn into the shadows of mystery and speculation. What truly happened that night in Berkeley Castle? Was Edward smothered, poisoned, or killed by more gruesome means? One version of events, undoubtedly the most infamous, claims that Edward met his end through a method designed to leave no external trace. According to a chronicle written decades later, a red-hot iron was inserted into his body through a horn, inflicting fatal internal burns without visible wounds. This account first appeared in the writings of Geoffrey Luke Baker around 1350. His description is both vivid and horrifying, suggesting a deliberate effort to erase Edward without drawing suspicion. But many modern historians view this tale with skepticism. They argue that the story of the red-hot poker may have been nothing more than a piece of political propaganda, designed to vilify Mortimer and legitimize the actions of Edward III, who would later overthrow Mortimer and imprison his own mother. In the end, the true circumstances of Edward II's death remain uncertain. Was he murdered in cold blood? Did he die from neglect? Or did he, as some fringe theories suggest, escape and live out his final days in secret exile? While we may never know the full truth, one thing is certain. The fall of Edward II was a tragic tale of betrayal, obsession, and the deadly consequences of power left unchecked. The death of King Edward II stands as one of the most infamous and unsettling episodes in the annals of English royal history. Over the centuries, the story of his alleged murder has evolved into a deeply symbolic tale, soaked in political intrigue, scandal, and brutal imagination. According to the traditional account, Edward was killed in a horrific manner, one designed not only to end his life but to dishonor him in death. The lurid detail that has survived, his murder by means of a red-hot iron inserted into his body, was likely not chosen randomly. It was a method crafted to maximize humiliation and to leave no visible wounds, feeding both the imagination and the political agenda of those who sought to justify his deposition. It served a dual purpose: to demonize those held responsible for his death and, simultaneously, to make a statement about Edward himself, tying his supposed sexual preferences directly to the nature of his execution. In an era when masculinity and authority were tightly bound, the image of a disgraced king meeting such an end was a powerful symbol of condemnation. Yet this account, as dramatic and haunting as it is, has long been called into question by historians. Many scholars argue that if Edward was indeed murdered, the method would likely have been far more discreet. Smothering with pillows or suffocating in his sleep would have been easier, quieter, and left no physical marks, perfect for a death that was meant to be hidden behind palace walls. The theatrical horror of the hot iron, they say, feels more like a piece of propaganda than a credible assassination. But the mystery deepens even further when we consider an alternative theory, one that suggests Edward may not have died that night in 1327 at all. In 1333, 6 years after his supposed death, a strange and controversial letter surfaced, sent to King Edward III. It would come to be known as the Fiasca Letter. In it, an Italian cleric named Manuel Fieschi claimed that he had personally heard the confession of Edward II, alive and in hiding years after the date of his death. According to the letter, Edward had managed to escape from Berkeley Castle, the site of his supposed murder. A porter's body, dressed in royal garments, was presented as Edward's, while the real king fled into obscurity. From there, the tale becomes even more incredible. Edward is said to have traveled across Europe in secret, eventually settling in a distant part of Italy, where he lived out his days as a hermit, unknown and unnoticed. At first glance, this version seems more legend than fact, but it would be given unexpected support 5 years later, in 1338, when a man appeared at the court of the Holy Roman Empire in the city of Koblenz. He called himself William the Welshman, but what shocked the court was his claim. He insisted that he was Edward II, alive and returned. Most dismissed him as a pretender or a madman, but the fact that multiple accounts surfaced so soon after the king's alleged death has led some historians to wonder. Could there have been some truth behind the myth? Despite the uncertainty, the English crown had already committed to the official version of events. In December 1327, a royal funeral was held for Edward II at Gloucester Cathedral. His tomb was elaborate and stately, as befitted a monarch, and it remains a prominent feature of the cathedral to this day. The body buried there had been embalmed, a common practice for royalty at the time, but one that makes identifying signs of violence or trauma nearly impossible. If there had been wounds, they were long hidden beneath the work of those who prepare the body. In the years that followed, Edward III, who had taken the throne as a young man, would take revenge on the men blamed for his father's downfall. Hugh de Gurney was executed, and Maltravers was driven into exile. Whether this was a true act of justice or a political maneuver to distance himself from the events of 1327 is open to interpretation, but the result was clear. The young king sought to put the matter to rest by punishing those responsible. Yet the tale of Edward II refused to fade. In the late 16th century, the English playwright Christopher Marlowe resurrected the story in his famous drama, Edward II. In Marlowe's hands, Edward becomes a tragic figure, weak, passionate, and ultimately destroyed by a world that could not accept him. While Marlowe never explicitly describes the king's gruesome death on stage, later theatrical productions often include the infamous red-hot iron scene, ensuring that this version of events would remain etched in public consciousness. It became not just a historical rumor, but a dramatic ritual, reenacted time and again to remind audiences of the danger of personal vulnerability in the halls of power. But Edward's downfall was more than just a personal tragedy. It was a turning point in the political history of medieval England. His forced abdication marked one of the first times a reigning English monarch was officially deposed by his own subjects. This shattered the long-standing belief in the divine right of kings, the idea that monarchs were chosen by God and could not be lawfully removed. Edward's fall revealed that a king's authority was not absolute, and that political alliances, public opinion, and raw ambition could unmake even the most sacred crown. This precedent would echo through English history, setting the stage for future depositions like those of Richard II and Henry VI. The notion that kings could be judged, removed, and replaced had been born. In another sense, the legend of Edward II's fall created a template for how sexuality and scandal could be weaponized in political struggles. His close relationships with male favorites, especially Piers Gvestin and Hugh Despenser, became central to the narrative of his failure. The story suggested, whether subtly or overtly, that his downfall was tied to his inability to conform to the expectations of masculinity and kingship. This idea that deviant sexual behavior led inevitably to political disaster would persist for centuries, shaping the way historians, writers, and the public viewed rulers like James I of England or Henry III of France. Whether true or not, the association between personal desire and royal catastrophe had been firmly established. And so, the question lingers, what truly became of Edward II? Was he tortured and murdered in the dungeons of Berkeley Castle? Was he quietly smothered and buried in secret? Or did he somehow escape, living out his remaining years in silent exile, his identity hidden behind the veil of a false death? We may never know, but what we can say with certainty is that his story endures because it speaks to something deeper than just politics. It is the story of a man torn between personal love and public duty, between who he was and who the world demanded he be. Even now, nearly 700 years later, visitors to Gloucester Cathedral pause before Edward II's tomb. They gaze upon the serene alabaster effigy of the fallen king, carved in dignity and stillness, as if untouched by the horrors that legend has laid upon his name. There are no signs of violence, no trace of the iron or betrayal, only the calm face of a monarch frozen in time. This quiet, noble image stands in stark contrast to the chaos and cruelty of the story that surrounds him. And perhaps that contrast is the final chapter in Edward's legacy, a life remembered not just for its end, but for the impossible tension between a crown and a conscience, between royal power and the human heart.